Jujutsu Kaisen to me is among one of the more interesting series in Shonen Jump. Its ability to express unique and unusual themes is refreshing, such as its expression of isolation, which is handled in a particularly interesting way, given that even in our current day, as each of us go through similar sorts of isolation within our lives, suffering in our own unique ways. Compared to its contemporaries, it tends to deal with more complicated messages and tries not to forcibly place them into the many subjective categories such as good or bad, with some obvious exceptions, with this video primarily being focused on the good versus bad, or evil, dynamic in Jujutsu Kaisen. As is the case with most stories, there is usually a point from which the viewer can learn from, the experiences of its characters, their points of view, and overarching themes, such as the story of Hansel and Gretel, which heavily emphasizes and goes over the warnings of stranger danger. Jujutsu Kaisen, too, has a message it means to convey to an audience. The issue I've seen crop up that I would like to address with this video is the lack of understanding of these messages / message. Seeing this ubiquitous misunderstanding, I felt a deep sense of obligation to give the most accurate interpretation of such messaging that I am capable of producing, to help others understand what I find to be a very profound narrative that can teach people a lot of things. Another way of understanding this question is, what are the lessons being imparted by Jujutsu Kaisen, which all of Twitter can attest to having zero ability to understand or to discern. So then, what are these messages? What does the author, Akutami Gege, mean when she writes Jujutsu Kaisen? Like a river that flows through each page, chapter, and character to arrive at the sea that is the audience. To start things off on a more simple note, I'd wager many of you are able to understand one such theme: selfishness. Time and time again, Akutami depicts selfish characters as successful. Those that have abandoned any sense of moral virtue are often depicted as being physically or spiritually superior to those of a stronger character, intentionally displaying the wicked escaping a judgment whilst those that struggle are ignored. Akutami intentionally writes characters such as Sukuna or Kenjaku being the walking embodiments of narcissism and hedonism, less in the sense of self-love, but in the sense of being the center of their own worlds. Ryoma Sukuna views all other actors as props to which he can use to enhance his own role on the stage, carelessly discarding them when they have served their purpose. And just as he says, those actors are simply ways to pass the time until his performance ends. Other characters, such as Kenjaku, are slaves to their own curiosity, with Kenjaku being widely recognized as the most evil sorcerer in history, solely due to the whip of curiosity cracking at his back, compelling him to commit all manner of evil in the name of knowing. Thus exists the air of selfishness intimately woven into the story's tapestry. The most interesting part of Jujutsu Kaisen is that Akutami does not oppose this air with an equal force of selflessness initially, but instead opts to punish the characters that are selfless, most accurately embodied by Yuji Itadori, whom I have spoken about many times. Through the protagonist, Yuji Itadori, Akutami seeks to demonstrate how a blind innocence cloaked in selflessness is easily broken down and proven to be ineffective, but further goes on to show how, when constructed and molded in a very particular way, can be just as menacing and dangerous as the natural disaster that Sukuna is prescribed. Early Jujutsu Kaisen, namely chapters before the Shibuya incident, serve to demonstrate Yuji's unwavering commitment to what he deems as good. Through and through, Yuji exemplifies the archetype of goodness. He is well-meaning, non-judgmental, and caring to a fault, placing his own life at risk for the safety of strangers. If Yuji were a real person, he would be lauded as a saint because Akutami has portrayed him to be an example of goodness to which we all aspire to be. And so, Akutami takes this archetype and slowly breaks it apart piece by piece, with each arc eroding away a small piece of Yuji's quote-unquote goodness. The juvenile detention center picks apart Yuji's ignorance and naivety to evil by showing his reliance on Sukuna to escape the situation, underestimating his capacity for evil in the process. the first Mahito arc, chips at Yuji's ideals and establishes them as made of cracked glass through forcing him to kill the transfigured humans and making his inability to save Junpei apparent. The Goodwill event hands Yuji violence as his weapon to which he will wield against his enemies. Through Todo's teachings, Yuji understands the core fundamentals of cursed energy control and Black Flash, weapons and purpose, and the Origin of Obedience arc stains Yuji's crystal clear conscience with murder by forcing Yuji to kill his brothers Eso and Ketchizu. The Shibuya incident was not just a sudden turn of events for Yuji, like many would initially believe, but the culmination of each individual grain of sand that builds and builds into a heap until eventually Yuji's ideals cannot bear the weight and collapse under the pressure, which Mahito serves to explore. What the first 130 or so chapters of Jujutsu Kaisen aim to establish is that even the ultimate goodness can collapse and break when put under enough stress. Or, to be phrased another way, no matter how good you are, there is always a greater evil that can and will seek to destroy you. The message is bleak and leaves readers without a sense of catharsis, and that is by design. You are not meant to see a silver lining or see the light at the end of the tunnel, because by depriving the reader of that sense of hope, you are deeply connected to the character, or you are distanced from him. Those that connect to the bleak and tragic circumstances of Yuji's Shibuya incident understand on an intimate level the isolation and hopelessness that enshrouds the character. Whilst those that distance themselves from the character and begin to connect with other, stronger characters only prove the point Akutami is making by showing Sukuna as this strongest which everyone revolves around. That selflessness is weak and the selfish are strong, to which Sukuna builds upon when he states that people are drawn to the strong. Something apparent in the real world. Humans are drawn to leaders or figures that are stronger than their peers, whether physically, mentally, financially, idealistically, etc., etc. Akutami tries to drive home the idea that nothing good comes from being morally virtuous, that depravity, debauchery, and a general sense of moral degeneracy is in fact optimal for achieving success. Yuji demonstrates the spiritual desire to enact good, the internal obligation we feel to be virtuous, while Sukuna is the physical desire. Each action is to satisfy the carnal heart's fleeting whims with no greater purpose in mind. Once Shibuya finishes, Akutami has properly set the groundwork for this, and from there moves forward under this sort of axiom, and with each successive encounter or narrative beat, we are reminded of this axiom, this type of narrative and worldly foundation. The selfish overwhelmingly represents success in Jujutsu Kaisen, with the selfless very scarcely seeing any success, just as it is in the real world most of the time. Even the main characters fail to exemplify proper selflessness, with Yuta, Maki, Hikari, and Gojo all having very major selfish character traits proportional to their selflessness. They are balanced, which is why they are weaker than Ryoma and Sukuna, and, excluding Gojo, Kenjaku as well. This is where Akutami brings back her protagonist, as many themes and threads are resolved through him. Over the course of the Culling Games, Akutami picks up the pieces she had surgically removed from Yuji and deliberately reconstructs them under a new framing. The window shifts from selflessness and moral virtue is observably inferior. Naturally, this idea comes off as idiosyncratic and obtuse. How can selflessness and selfishness be functionally different or the same when they are most simply descriptions of actions and or beliefs? This is where Akutami uses the standard format of shonen to deliver a much deeper message. Most readers of shonen battle manga expect fights and battles. When you read Dragon Ball, Naruto, or Bleach, you expect to see a fight, and Akutami knows this. By reconstructing Yuji through the Culling Games, Gege redefines the idea that selflessness is weak by constructing Yuji into the mirror image of Sukuna. Where Sukuna is hedonistic, Yuji is coldly virtuous. Where Sukuna kills for pleasure, Yuji kills for duty. And where Sukuna shows apathy, Yuji shows obsession. Through this mirror imaging, Akutami frames selflessness as functionally identical to selfishness, as a mechanism to achieving power. She recharacterizes her entire story up to this point by showing that goodness was not observably inferior to evilness, but simply that it was more difficult to use. This is why we see Yuji stand on equal ground, if not superior ground, to Sukuna in chapter 257 and up, whilst Yuta and others like Maki struggle in similar situations, purely visually speaking. Because Yuji is able to wield the mechanics of moral virtue to the same extent that Sukuna is able to wield immorality. If Yuta and Maki were of similar conviction, they would also be able to stand against Sukuna far better than they did, but because they are unable to let go of those parts of the self, Yuji succeeds over them because he is completely devoted to upholding that virtue, even if it means leaving himself with nothing by the end, with the most common example being constantly willing to, quote, self-delete, if it meant stopping Sukuna, the greatest evil in his eyes. The core message that Akutami is trying to say then, through Jujutsu Kaisen up to now, is that even though good people may be broken down and subjugated by the wicked, through strength of belief in goodness, you can rise to be even greater than that of evil, and through moral virtue, you can defeat evil. Even if your spirit, mind, and body are broken beyond repair, through virtue and goodness, you can quite literally tear out the heart of evil, severing its body inch by inch until you, with your own hands, tear out that which you care for most, shown by Yuji literally trying to tear out Sukuna's heart to rescue his friend. In the pursuit of good, Yuji has become just as lethal as Sukuna, and that makes him appear to be no different to Sukuna. This is the magnum opus of Jujutsu Kaisen, the question of how much are you willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of goodness, and through Yuji, Gege delivers an answer to this. Yuji is willing to sacrifice everything in the pursuit of good, his life and potentially his friends and all else. Such is his dedication that even the very concept of evil that he views as curses are such anathema to Yuji that the very sight of Sukuna is enough to induce a blinding rage within him. Such is the devotion to good that the mere sight of evil compels Itadori to tear out its heart and eviscerate its body until there is naught but dust and ash. The point of Yuji and Sukuna's dynamic is showing that just because we suffer does not mean that we are weaker. The good may be trampled, oppressed, and violently assailed, but ultimately good will bring about something incomparably worse upon that which is evil. The evildoer may injure, but the retribution of good will tear asunder that which is evil. As a Christian, this speaks to me quite deeply, because although it's obviously not entirely true, it mostly represents that intrinsic capacity for good that we all have. It would be so easy for Yuji to be just as evil as Sukuna, to lose his mind and start killing him indiscriminately, but he doesn't, because that capacity for good is so deeply ingrained into him that he feels an obligation to rip out evil wherever he finds it, shown most prominently by his I am a cog mentality. Yuji does not question his function, but will always obey it. The cog in the machine will only fail to turn if it is broken. So long as Yuji stands, the wheel will turn him, and thus he will tear apart curses until he breaks or his purpose is served. It can be seen in some ways as Yuji also embodying humility and having a distinct lack of pride. Yuji does not enjoy exercising curses, nor does he praise himself when he does so. To him, it's simply a requirement, no different to breathing, just a given that it will be done. Jujutsu Kaisen has such a unique framing when it comes to good versus evil that it's become one of my favorite parts of the series. Other shonen such as Naruto or Bleach will speak on matters of fatalism or nihilism or other philosophical concepts, but ultimately you can kind of feel a clear distinction between the actions of the good and the bad. Obviously there's a lot more deeper context to this, and you can very well argue these characters are morally grey. It's just an example. With Jujutsu Kaisen, however, the series makes a great effort to show all characters that succeed succumb to the doctrine of its primary antagonist, Roman Sukuna, to which everyone can pretty much agree is very evil. Those with moral standards that prevent them from becoming less virtuous, such as Nanami, are gate-kept from higher powers, whilst those around them flourish through degeneracy, which is why seeing the protagonist essentially show that even though this immorality flourishes and acts as though it's power incarnate, moral virtue is far more dangerous and is far more imposing, like a much more dangerous beast that is impossible to overcome. Yuji embodies the inevitability of justice and retribution, of good. Sukuna escaped justice for 1,000 years, but no matter how long he goes, eventually a good will rise to seek him out and punish him for his sins, and that is what Yuji embodies. He is not the judge, but the enforcer of good that Sukuna cannot seem to overpower, not because he is physically or spiritually weaker, but because Yuji is the manifestation of justice itself, specifically against Sukuna. Much like how Maki is the manifestation of Naoya's punishment, or how Yuta is the one to enact justice upon Geto and Kenjaku, Yuji is the moral executor of Sukuna's punishment. Sukuna, at the same time, feels compelled to disprove these ideas. Yuji presents this unbreakable wall, which agitates and discomforts Sukuna, and so his immorality spikes and rises to try and overcome Yuji in an effort to disprove Yuji's worldview, unknowingly sharpening its edges as he does so. As the more vile Sukuna becomes, the more Yuji's virtue strengthens to crush it in response. This is just one of so many more messages within Jujutsu Kaisen, just as equally as Yuji and Sukuna representing how good always overcomes evil, even when pushed to its breaking point, among so much more. Other characters embody separate but relatively equally significant messages, such as the aforementioned Maki and Naoya embodying freedom and enslavement to belief, or how Gojo and Geto represent love and duty. So many messages are woven into Jujutsu Kaisen that I think it's a one-of-a-kind manga that can stand among the best of them in the shonen space. Thank you all for watching, and may peace be with you.